Tonight, we will wander through a story carved in both myth and memory. One that began not in temples or scrolls, but in the quiet hum of a console, beneath the soft glow of screens that once lit the faces of dreamers. It is a tale where gods bled, where mountains burned, and where a single voice, weary and human, echoed louder than Olympus itself. This is the legend of God of war, not of conquest, but of remembrance. Of a man who once carried rage like a flame in his chest and learned at last to hold it like light. It is the story of Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, born in war, shaped by sorrow, and haunted by the silence of gods. Beneath every battle, there was grief. Beneath every victory, a prayer whispered to no one. Yet beyond the chaos and ruin lies something gentler, the ache of redemption, the search for peace after eternity's storm. For even a warrior, when the world grows quiet, must face the echo of his own heart. And somewhere in that silence, he finds not vengeance, but grace. Before we begin, tell me, what games do you find yourself playing before sleep finds you? Write your answer in the comments below. I'd love to read them later. And if you enjoy these calm journeys through myth and memory, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep this space alive, a place where legends still breathe beneath the quiet stars. Long before the name Kratos was whispered in fear, before his ashes turned the air pale with grief, there was only a man, a soldier, bound not yet by destiny, but by devotion. The world then was still young with thunder. The gods walked among mortals as if the earth were their reflection, and the sky itself trembled under their moods. In those days, war was not a curse, but a prayer, an offering to Olympus, where blood and glory were the language of worship. Kratos had been a child of Sparta, born beneath the shadow of discipline and fire. His every breath had been shaped by the sound of blades against shields, the rhythm of commands shouted under the sun. In his youth, he believed that war was the purest form of truth, that in the clash of iron and will, a man could find the shape of his soul. His heart burned with purpose, his eyes clear and cold, his faith in victory absolute. He rose quickly through the ranks, not because of favor, but because of fury. Even then, he carried a silence within him, a stillness that others mistook for calm, but which was only the waiting of a storm. When he fought, there was no hesitation, no mercy. He was not cruel, but precise, as if each strike had already been written. The Spartans began to speak his name with reverence, and their enemies learned to speak it with dread. But war is a patient teacher, and every victory carries its lesson in loss. One night, under a blood-red moon, Kratos led his army against a horde far greater than his own, a tide of men and beasts who moved like smoke across the land. His soldiers fought bravely, but the sea of blades swallowed them. And when the end came, he knelt upon the battlefield, blood and dust staining his skin, and called out not to his men, but to the gods. He did not ask for mercy. He asked for power. In the chaos of his prayer, the world shifted. The wind grew still. The sky darkened as if the sun itself recoiled from what was to come. From the storm descended Ares, the god of war, his armor burning with celestial fire, his eyes two embers of unending wrath. He looked upon the fallen warrior and saw something familiar, a hunger that mirrored his own. Ares granted Kratos his wish. With a voice that cracked the sky, he bound to him the blades of chaos, twin weapons forged not from metal, but from torment. Their chains burned his flesh as they fused to his arms, each link a vow that could not be broken. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, Kratos felt something else, strength, vast and terrible, pouring into his veins like molten gold. When he rose again, he was no longer merely mortal. His eyes, once full of discipline, now burned with something greater than rage, a divine fury that devoured doubt. With Ares as his master, Kratos became the living embodiment of war itself. Villages fell to ash in his wake, temples burned, and even the bravest warriors fled before the storm that wore a man's face. Yet in the heart of every flame he lit, there flickered a question he could not name. The power had filled him, but it had also hollowed him. The chains that gave him strength also pulled at his soul, binding not his arms, but his will. Ares had given him purpose, but not peace. The god demanded obedience, and Kratos, ever loyal, ever relentless, obeyed. Years passed, and the world came to know him not as a hero, but as a weapon. He fought because he must. He killed because it was what he had been made to do. But in the rare moments between battle and sleep, when the fires dimmed and silence settled like dust, he would remember the sound of laughter, faint, distant, from a home long gone. The face of a woman, the warmth of a child's hand, shadows that visited him only in dreams. And then came the day the dream turned to nightmare. It was a village like any other, small, hidden in the folds of a forest, the scent of myrrh and smoke in the air. Ares had commanded him to destroy it, to raise it as an offering to his glory. Kratos obeyed without question. The blades sang, the world burned, and when the firelight dimmed, he saw what the gods had taken from him. His wife, his daughter, the chains that once gleamed now dripped with ash. The silence that followed was not peace, but ruin. In that moment, the god of war's chosen turned his eyes to the heavens and screamed, not in rage, but in despair so deep it shattered the sky. His prayer was no longer a plea for strength, but a curse. The gods had made him their instrument, and in doing so, they had unmade him. The ashes of his family clung to his skin, marking him forever as a ghost. From that day, Kratos would carry their memory not upon his shoulders, but upon his very flesh, a reminder that the divine could wound deeper than any blade. He cast his gaze upon the horizon, where Olympus gleamed like a cruel crown against the sun. The world around him was silent now, the fire gone, the smoke thin, the wind still. And in that silence, something stirred within him, not rage but resolve. For the first time, he no longer knelt to the gods. He turned his back on Ares, on the heavens that had chained him, and walked into the wilderness with only his sorrow for company. The chains still burned, the blades still whispered, but within their clamor was a new voice, his own. And as he walked through the ruins of what had been his life, the world seemed to hold its breath. For somewhere in the distance, Olympus trembled. The gods had created a warrior to serve them. What they had unknowingly created was their undoing. The story of Kratos had only begun, not as a tale of vengeance, but as the slow, quiet awakening of a man who had once believed in gods, and now believed in nothing at all. The mountain watched him go, the chains gleaming faintly in the dying light. Above, the sky turned crimson, not from war, but from memory. And in that glow, the Ghost of Sparta was born. The road that followed was not made of stone or sand, but of silence, a silence that stretched like the sea and pressed upon his soul with the weight of all that had been lost. Each step Kratos took echoed against the ruins of his own doing. The forests that once sang with life now whispered of fire. The rivers, which once carried reflections of dawn, now flowed thick with the memory of war. He was both wanderer and wound, a man walking through the shadow of himself. The chains clattered softly as he moved, their sound a cruel lullaby. Each link held a memory, each scar a name he could never forget. The blades of chaos, once his pride, had become his punishment, forged not by gods but by guilt. When he looked upon their flame, he saw not power, but penance. And though he tried to cast them away, they always returned, drawn to his skin as if the gods themselves refused to let him forget. Nights were the cruelest. Sleep offered no rest, only return. He dreamed of the day his daughter ran to him, laughing, her hands outstretched. He dreamed of her eyes, wide and unknowing as the flames took everything. And when he awoke, the air around him trembled, not with storm, but with the quiet tremor of rage held too long. There were whispers in those nights, faint and sorrowful. Some said the spirits of the dead followed him. Others claimed it was the gods, mocking his grief. Kratos did not listen. He had no prayers left. His faith had burned away with his family, leaving only the ghost of a man who had once believed that victory could save him. In the distance, the world continued. Cities rose, kingdoms warred, temples sang. But wherever Kratos went, silence followed. It was as though the earth itself recoiled, unwilling to bear his tread. He wandered across deserts and snow, through forests where no bird dared call his name. Even the light seemed to fade around him, yet the gods had not forgotten him. They rarely do when their tools break. Ares, though proud, watched from his throne of flame, both furious and amused. He saw in Kratos not defiance but potential, a living scar upon the world that bore his mark. The other gods whispered of it too, some with pity, some with fear. The Ghost of Sparta, they called him, not god, not mortal, but something caught between. One night, beneath a moon pale as bone, Kratos stood at the edge of the sea. The waves broke against his feet, cold and relentless. In the distance, thunder rolled, faint and far, like the heartbeat of Olympus. He stared into the horizon and spoke softly to the wind. "I have served your cruelty. I have carried your name in blood. I am done." The sea offered no answer, only reflection. And in that reflection, he saw not the god's servant, but a man stripped of all things divine. He was hollow, yes, but within that hollowing, there was something new. The faintest flicker of will that belonged to no god at all. As he turned to leave, he felt the chains tremble. Not in anger, but in mourning. For even they seemed to know that the man they bound was no longer the one who had worn them willingly. He walked inland, away from the water, away from Olympus, away from everything that had once defined him. The night around him deepened. The world seemed to breathe. He wandered for years. His name became legend and curse alike, a story told by frightened children and drunken soldiers. Some said he could not die. Others claimed he was death itself. But those who looked into his eyes knew the truth. He was a man still searching for an end that the gods would not grant. And then came the whisper, soft, almost human, that spoke of a chance for redemption. A promise, faint and flickering, that the chains could be broken, that the gods could be challenged, that fate itself could be rewritten. Kratos did not believe it. Yet in the stillness of his heart something stirred. Not hope, not faith, something quieter. The desire to see if the gods could bleed. He began to move again, this time not as a wanderer, but as a storm returning to the mountain. His steps grew heavier, his silence more certain. He no longer walked to escape his past, he walked to confront it. Olympus had created him. Now, he would remind it of what it had made. The wind rose around him, carrying the scent of ash. The horizon glowed faintly, as if the world itself anticipated what was to come. And in that growing light, the Ghost of Sparta lifted his head for the first time in years. The fire in his eyes had not dimmed, it had only learned to burn without sound. He would climb the mountain again, not to beg, not to serve, but to end. And though the gods did not yet know it, their fall had already begun, with a single man, walking alone beneath the endless sky, dragging behind him the chains of his own creation. At dawn, the sea was quiet again. The waves lapped gently at the shore where his footprints had faded. The wind carried only the sound of chains, faint, distant like memory. Somewhere above, Olympus shimmered, proud and unaware. And deep within the world's silence, a new prayer began, not from the lips of men, but from the heart of one who no longer prayed, a promise whispered to no one. That the gods, too, could be broken. The mountain kept its silhouette against a sky that had learned to look away. Olympus rose like a memory, pale, veined, composed of 1,000 prayers pressed into stone, and for a long while it had been the world's compass. Men measured their days by its shadow, sailors swore by its weather, children grew up knowing the gods' names as if they were seasons. The halls above gleamed in those old tales, not merely with gold but with intent. Each column was a law, each torch a covenant. But covenants grow brittle when repeated without listening. In the long centuries, the gods had become accustomed to being mirrored, not answered. Their splendor fed on praise until praise was a river that drowned all nuance. They began to speak in decrees rather than counsel, to wear ritual like armor, to trade mercy for majesty. Olympus, once tender with oversight, hardened into an edifice of habit. The winds that once obeyed a promise of balance now bent toward rivalry. The seas that once sang in time with thunder now clashed in the gods' petty reckonings. Mortals felt it first as weather and famine, then as the slow corrosion of trust. The fall did not happen in a single hour. It came as accumulation, 1,000 small betrayals, a century of favors twisted into debts. Temples tolerated the quiet at their altars because habit is a kind of faith. Priests kept their rites because noise comforts the uncertain heart. But beneath the marble, the world stirred. There are places the old ones call thin, thresholds where breath and stone meet. And when the mountain's fishers remembered their first voice, they began to hum again, not with new commands, but with an old, steady pulse. The earth reminding itself that it had wait apart from worship. Kratos felt that pulse like an ache in his bones. He was not a scholar of the high courts of Olympus. He had been raised where strength answered need and blood signed oaths. Yet even his savage education could read the shape of an ending. He approached the mountain not as a thief in the night, but like one walking into a chapel he had once tended and found empty. The road up was littered with relics of belief, votive figures, rusted spears, laurel thrown down like tired laurels, as if worship itself had grown exhausted and set aside its garlands. Statues leaned toward decay. Their faces, once exacting, had softened into wonderless masks. Inside the halls, there were echoes of theology as much as ruin. Where councils had once argued the tides of fate, silence now answered. Zeus' throne was a hollow more than a seat. Athena's library held dust where counsel used to bloom. The gods who had once embodied law now resembled the long, silent rooms of a palace. Their stories remained carved in frieze and hymn, but stories without listeners become funerary art. The priests who still remained moved like caretakers of a museum, cataloguing what once decided lives. They performed the rites because memory demanded it, not because the sky obliged. The decline changed the world in subtler ways than any battlefield could. The seasons unfurled less as commands and more as natural rhythms reclaiming themselves. Rivers returned to courses unmoored from divine favor. Storms visited because weather moves, not because a god chose whimsy. Where once Apollo bent light to message, now light simply traveled. Where Poseidon flexed his will, the sea found its own voice in tides and currents. Mortals began to taste a strange liberty, to plant without asking permission, to build without awaiting signs. It was a small revolution, quiet, domestic, but revolutions are made of such small things. Yet even as the world remembered how to breathe without Olympus, there were remnants of the old order that lingered like aftersound. Temples still collected offerings, oracles still clung to their rites. Some gods did not vanish so much as retreat inward, their attentions folded like ink on a page. They became specters of former duties, storms that spoke in mood rather than mandate, harvests that listened to weather and soil more than to prayer. And in that folding, their divinity transmuted into pattern, the moral geometry of story, the lesson worn into language, cautionary, affectionate, and permanent. Kratos walked among these remnants as a witness and as an instrument of their undoing. His journey up the mountain was not purely a march of vengeance. It had become a procession of revelation. Each pillar he passed told a parable, of favors traded for fear, of rites that privileged spectacle over mercy, of a people who gave their gods the shape of their worst desires and were answered in kind. The blades of chaos at his wrists were less a symbol of triumph here than a ledger, the gods' accounts written in scar and flame. In every hall his shadow crossed, old hymns seemed to tremble into new meanings. A prayer once uttered to keep a child safe now read as a plea that had been denied. When he reached those highest rooms, he found not thunder but a thin, cold light, as though the sky itself had turned to watch with curiosity rather than command. The gods met him, not with unified fury, but with private astonishment. Ares, who had once delighted in the pure arithmetic of killing, appeared like a man surprised to discover his own emptiness. Athena's eyes were soft with a quiet reproach, as if wisdom itself had been surprised to find folly seated upon its throne. In their faces, Kratos read not the caricature of tyrants, but something humanized by obsolescence. Grief, fatigue, the awkwardness of beings realizing their songs no longer carry. There was no thunderous judgment when the age finally unraveled. There was a conversation of endings. Zeus, who had learned the language of law long before he learned the language of listening, spoke with a voice that had the creak of old timber. He confessed, in tones that were more rueful than repentant, that rulership without reciprocity is only solitary reign. The admission was small but seismic. Gods who do not answer become gods who are no longer answered. In that exchange, there was no triumphant retribution, only the slow, intimate collapse of authority into memory. The unmaking spread outward like a tide that had no need for violence to do its work. Temples lost their heat, treasuries emptied into the quiet good works of survivors, and hymns thinned into lullabies. Communities reorganized not under edict, but by habit and necessity. A farmer consulted the weather rather than a priest. A sailor read the moon rather than the omen. The moral scaffolding left by Olympus did not vanish. It passed into law, into art, into the quiet customs of village life, where it remained useful but no longer sacred. Kratos left the mountain by a path that no longer required glory. He carried with him not trophies, but memories, names of those who had been given and lost by gods who had simply never considered the cost. The chains at his wrists clinked like metronomes, marking time rather than threat. Yet as he walked down into plains reclaimed by wheat and laughter, the collapse of Olympus registered on the world not as apocalypse, but as a long, complex exhale. People began to plant groves where altars had stood. Children learned to tell the old myths as stories, useful, beautiful, instructive, rather than as treaties that bound existence. In the end, the silence that fell over Olympus was both mourning and gift. It mourned what had been, the brilliant arrogance of beings who believed themselves beyond consequence, and it gave back to the world a space to be remade. The gods receded into pattern and parable. Mortals returned to the small, stubborn labor of living. Kratos, who had once been called the instrument of divine will, became something else in the telling, a reminder that even the greatest orders must answer for what they make. He had not broken the heavens as much as he had shown them their reflection, and after the mirror, shattered new things could be built from the shards. When the light settled on the low hills, and the first voices of a new morning rose from meadows that no longer feared a god's whim, the mountain sighed, not in defeat, but in the soft resignation of something finally understood. The stories would continue. New gods might one day be imagined, and old ones remembered. But the age when Olympus decided without debate had ended. A different world took the breath the gods left behind, fuller and quieter, learning how to hold its own small lights. The mountain slept, but the world beneath it did not. When Olympus fell, its echo did not end in thunder. It rolled through time like a deep breath, reshaping everything it touched. The stones remembered, the rivers shifted, and even the stars seemed to pause in their eternal motion. The gods were gone, yes, but their absence was not silence. It was resonance. The old world began to unweave itself. In the cities below, temples once filled with incense now stood hollow, their altars cold. Statues cracked in the frost of neglect. Their marble eyes turned toward horizons they no longer ruled. Priests, who had once spoken with the certainty of lightning, found that their prayers no longer carried beyond the walls. The hymns they sang returned to them as echoes, stripped of power, but rich in truth. For the first time, they heard their own words as mortals do. The people changed first. Freed from the command of unseen hands, They began to ask questions that once would have been forbidden. What if the rain was not Zeus's mercy, but the sky's natural gift? What if wisdom came not from Athena's favor, but from patience and time? And what if courage, that sacred flame they once begged for, was simply the birthright of every beating heart? From these questions rose the dawn of a new understanding, that divinity could live within man, and not above him. The scholars began to write again. Philosophers emerged from exile and spoke of a universe bound not by divine order, but by rhythm, the slow, endless pulse of existence itself. Farmers, no longer sacrificing lambs to a thundercloud, learned the dance of the seasons by watching the moon. Sailors followed the constellations not as deities, but as companions. The gods, in their vanishing, had gifted mortals the most dangerous treasure of all, freedom. Yet Olympus had not vanished entirely. Its bones remained, lodged between cloud and light. The mountains still shimmered at dusk, when the last rays of sun crowned its peaks in gold. And those who dared to climb its slopes claimed that sometimes, beneath the wind, they could hear faint voices, not in anger, but in memory. The gods were not gone, the old mystics said. They had simply become what they were always meant to be, stories. But even stories have power. As the centuries unfolded, the myths of Olympus began to blend with the rhythm of mortal life. The gods transformed from rulers to reflections. Zeus became a symbol of justice and storm, Athena of thought and reason, Apollo of beauty and renewal. They were no longer beings to be feared, but archetypes to be remembered, constellations of meaning in the human heart. Children learned their tales beside the hearth, their parents' voices soft as dusk, and the lessons of divinity were passed down not through command, but through story. In this new age, Kratos was both remembered and forgotten. Some said he perished with Olympus, swallowed by the ruin he had wrought. Others believed he walked still, somewhere far from the lands of Greece, seeking peace in the quiet corners of the world. Bards sang of him in the language of paradox, the god who killed gods, the man who broke eternity to rebuild his soul. To some, he was vengeance incarnate, to others, redemption itself. But all agreed on one thing, that he had been both destroyer and midwife to a world reborn. There were places remote, quiet, wind-touched, where the earth still bore the mark of divine conflict, mountains cracked like scars, rivers glowed faintly with celestial dust, and deep within caves, whispers of the old power still drifted like dreams. Travelers who lingered too long claimed to see shapes in the mist, a woman of light walking beside a flame, a great hand reaching for the sky, a warrior's shadow fading into snow. These visions brought neither comfort nor fear. They were the remnants of the divine, the breath of a myth learning to rest. The philosophers of that age began to call it the dimming. Not the death of the gods, but the withdrawal of the sacred into subtler forms. The old divinity, they wrote, had not ended, it had simply dispersed. Into the waves that struck the shore, into the fire that warmed the hearth, into the hearts of men and women who dared to love despite loss, who built despite ruin, who dreamed despite silence. Kratos became, in time, less a name than a mirror. He was the embodiment of a truth so old that even the gods had forgotten it, that creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners. The breaking of Olympus had not been the end of the sacred, it had been its renewal. By falling, the gods had returned their fire to the world. And in the quiet that followed, mortals began to burn with it. There were those who believed that, in the final moment of Olympus's fall, the gods had spoken to Kratos, not in words, but in knowing. That they had understood, at last, the purpose of their own undoing, to give humanity the space to rise. The mountain's collapse was not wrath, but surrender, the slow bowing of the divine before its creation. And Kratos, though he had carried their end in his hands, had also carried their legacy, a reminder that even in destruction, there can be mercy. The years passed. The mountain grew quiet. Forests climbed its slopes again. Rivers traced new paths down its flanks. Wildflowers bloomed where thrones once stood. The wind that moved through its ruins was gentle now, cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Birds nested where marble once gleamed. Moss covered the altars. And when the sun set, the stones glowed faintly with an inner light, as if remembering what it had meant to be divine. Far below, in the valleys and villages, the people told new stories. They spoke of the time when the sky had burned, and a man had walked among the gods. They did not speak of wrath or vengeance, but of silence, of the moment when even thunder paused to listen. They said that when the last flame on Olympus went out, a single spark had drifted down to the earth, and from it, mankind had learned to kindle fire. That was the gift the gods left behind. Not miracles, not commandments, but the power to create warmth from ruin. And so, in the stillness that followed the end of heaven, the world began again. Children were born under skies that no longer threatened. Harvests grew without prayers. Lovers carved their names into trees instead of temples, and somewhere in the wind, the faintest echo of divine laughter lingered, not mocking, but content. For perhaps the gods, in their final hour, had learned what even eternity had forgotten, that to rule is not to live forever, but to be remembered with gentleness. And as the stars returned to their places, steady and eternal, the mountain, once the center of all creation, exhaled one last time. Its breath became the mist that crowned its summit. Its heart became the wind that moved across the world, and its silence became the hymn that mortals still hear when the night is very still. For in the end, Olympus did not fall, it changed form. And in that change, the divine was not lost, it was set free. The sea whispered to him before he ever saw it. It carried the scent of salt and cedar, of the old world fading into distance. The waves murmured like the low breath of something ancient and patient, folding upon themselves in endless rhythm. Kratos stood at the shoreline and listened, as though the ocean itself had something to say. Behind him, Greece slept beneath its ruins. The ashes of Olympus had cooled, its stones quiet beneath the morning sky. No lightning carved the heavens now, no divine song threaded through the air. The world was lighter without its gods, but emptier too, like a room cleared of furniture where every sound felt too loud, too fragile, too mortal. The chains still clung to his arms. Their weight had changed, once fire, now memory. The marks they left upon his skin were not wounds, but the faint scars of vows long broken. He had thought that leaving Olympus behind would free him, that walking away from the mountain meant walking into silence. But silence, he learned, is not freedom. It is a mirror, and mirrors remember. The sea waited, unjudging. Its waves curved toward him, gathering around his feet as if to test the measure of his resolve. He did not pray this time. He did not ask. He simply stepped forward, the cold rising around his knees, his waist, his chest. When the tide took him fully, he did not fight it. For days, or perhaps years, for time has no rhythm in exile, he drifted. The world beneath the waves was vast and strange, filled with colors that shimmered like forgotten thoughts. He slept in the cradle of the ocean, and in that sleep he dreamed. Not of war, not of flame, but of quiet things, the laughter of a child, the scent of olive trees, the hum of life untouched by gods. When he awoke, the sky was pale and foreign. The sea had carried him to a shore he did not know. The air bit at his lungs, sharp and cold. Snow clung to the earth like a veil. The sun hung low and red, as if weary from its long voyage across an unfamiliar sky. He rose, the frost crunching beneath his boots, and realized that the land itself breathed differently here, slower, older. The north. The wind carried names he did not yet understand, whispering them through the pines like half-remembered songs. Midgard, Jotunheim, Asgard, words that tasted of age, of frost and fire, of stories still waiting to be told. Here, gods did not sit upon golden thrones above the clouds. They walked among the storms. Their power was colder, quieter, but no less vast. Kratos began to walk inland. The forests were deep and endless, their branches heavy with snow. The trees here were not like the olive groves of home. They seemed alive in a different way, watchful, listening. Crows gathered in their limbs, their eyes like black stars. When he passed, they followed, their calls echoing like questions. He walked until the day grew dim, and the sky turned a soft blue-gray. A river wound through the forest, half frozen, glimmering faintly in the fading light. He knelt and touched the ice, his reflection wavering beneath it. The face that looked back at him was not the warrior of Greece. It was older, quieter, still marked by rage, but tempered by its own ashes. He made camp near the riverbank. The snow melted beneath the faint warmth of his fire, revealing patches of green beneath the frost. He ate little, spoke nothing. The night pressed close, thick and cold, but it did not frighten him. He had seen worse darkness, and this one at least was honest. Above him, the stars burned brighter than he had ever seen. They did not form the constellations of his youth. These skies told other stories: wolves chasing the sun, serpents coiled around the world, a great tree whose roots touched every realm. He stared at them until his eyes blurred, and for the first time in years he felt small, not from fear, but from wonder. There were other sounds in the night, distant howls, the groan of ice breaking upon the river, the sigh of wind through the trees. He recognized them as the pulse of this world, the rhythm that had replaced the thunder of Olympus. Here, nature did not bow to gods. It was God. When dawn came, he followed the river deeper into the woods. The light filtered through the trees like gold through mist, painting the snow in shades of amber. He saw the prints of animals, deer, foxes, wolves, crossing paths without fear. The world felt alive in a way he had forgotten, as though untouched by the corruption of power. And yet, beneath that peace, he felt it, a presence. It watched him without malice, but with recognition, as if the land itself knew what he carried. The chains, though silent, pulsed faintly against his skin. He felt the weight of his past pressing against this new world like two rivers colliding. He came upon a clearing where a great oak stood, its roots coiled deep into the earth, its branches heavy with frost. Beneath it, half buried in snow, was a stone altar marked with strange runes. He brushed the snow aside and traced the carvings with his hand. The symbols spoke of prophecy, of a cycle that turned without end: creation, conflict, renewal. He understood none of the language, but he knew the meaning. The story of gods never ends. It only changes its name. The wind rose, cold and sharp, carrying with it a whisper. He did not know the words, but their tone was familiar. A call, faint and distant, from something that knew him. He looked toward the north, where mountains pierced the sky like broken spears. There, he thought, the gods of this land waited, not as masters, but as echoes of the same song he had once tried to silence. He stood beneath the great oak, the chains at his wrists glinting faintly in the morning light, and breathed the frozen air. The world around him was new, but the story was old. The gods had fallen once. They would fall again. And as the snow began to fall, covering his tracks behind him, Kratos walked on, the ghost of Sparta crossing from myth into memory once more, carrying the quiet burden of one age into the heart of another. Behind him, the wind whispered through the trees, not of vengeance, but of beginnings. The snow had not ceased since dawn. It fell gently at first, drifting between the pines like ash from a fire too long forgotten. Then it thickened, and the world vanished into white. Kratos pressed forward through the quiet storm, his breath misting in the cold air, his steps steady and unhurried. The wind carried no threat, only a song, slow, mournful, ancient. He did not know where the path led. There were no roads in this place, no altars or ruins to mark the way. Yet something unseen guided him, a pull, faint but certain, leading him deeper into the heart of the northern wilds. Each step felt heavier, not from weariness, but from meaning. This land was not silent. It was listening. The trees here were older than any he had known in Greece. Their trunks twisted toward the sky like frozen flames, their roots breaking through the ice as if reaching for the memories buried below. Between them, he saw faint shapes, runes carved by hands long dead, glowing faintly with a blue light that pulsed like breath. The North, he realized, was not asleep. It dreamed, and he had walked into its dream. The storm eased by midday, and the forest opened into a vast valley. Mountains surrounded it like the ribs of a sleeping god, their peaks hidden by cloud and snow. A river cut through its center, black and shining, moving with a rhythm too deliberate to be mere water. As Kratos approached, he felt the air thicken, not with cold, but with presence. He stood at the river's edge and listened. Beneath the sound of rushing water was something deeper, a hum, low and constant, as though the world itself was singing in its sleep. The song had no melody, but it carried weight. It spoke of age, of cycles, of an endless weaving and unweaving of creation. He looked into the river and saw not his reflection, but a vision. Beneath the ice, something vast stirred, a shadow the size of mountains, coiled in on itself, its scales glimmering faintly with runes of starlight. Its eye opened once, enormous and calm, reflecting not his body but his spirit. The serpent. In that instant, the river went still, as if time itself held its breath. The great creature did not move. It did not strike. It simply looked at him, not with hostility, but with recognition. The gaze was ancient, patient, knowing. It was as though the serpent remembered him from before memory itself. When the vision faded, the river flowed again. The wind returned. The snow fell once more, soft and unassuming. But Kratos stood unmoving, his breath caught in the throat of the world. He had seen gods fall, had slain divine kings, and watched their light fade into dust. But this presence was different. It was not divine in the way Olympus had been. It was older, vast beyond worship, free of vanity. It was the pulse beneath existence, the echo that survives the death of empires. He turned away from the river and began to climb the nearest ridge. The serpent's song still resonated in the air, threading through the wind like a distant drumbeat. As he climbed, he began to notice things, small carvings in the rocks, runes etched into the cliffs, offerings left by unseen hands. This was a land that did not pray upward. It prayed inward. Its faith was woven into the earth itself. By dusk, the storm had cleared entirely. The sky above burned with ribbons of green and violet, lights that danced and shimmered like living flame. Kratos paused to watch them. The beauty of it unsettled him. It reminded him of things he had tried to forget, of firelight on a temple wall, of the soft glow of his daughter's smile. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, he was no longer thinking of Olympus. The air grew colder as night deepened. The forest changed again, the trees thinning, the snow hardening beneath his feet. In the distance, he saw the faint glow of fire. He approached cautiously, the sound of crackling wood cutting through the stillness. It was a small cabin, half buried in frost, its roof bowed beneath years of snow. No smoke rose from its chimney, and no sound came from within. He stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Dust lay thick on the table, and cobwebs draped the corners like veils. But the air was warm, impossibly warm, and the fire that burned in the hearth gave off no smoke. He moved closer, his eyes narrowing. The flames were blue. They danced with the same hue as the runes he had seen in the forest. He stood before the fire for a long time, the heat brushing his skin, and realized what he was seeing. This was not fire born of wood or spark. It was something older, the last remnant of divine power hidden here, far from the eyes of gods. A fragment of creation's first breath. The North, he thought, guarded its gods differently. They did not build towers to proclaim their power. They built silence. They buried divinity in the earth, in rivers and mountains and snow where no pride could find it. Here, even the sacred learned humility. He left the cabin before dawn. The air was still, and the forest shimmered faintly under the weight of frost. The serpent's hum had grown distant, replaced by another sound, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried beneath the snow. It followed him as he walked, steady and patient, as though the land itself walked with him. The mountains ahead grew steeper, the valleys deeper. He passed ancient stones carved with scenes of creation, gods wrestling with beasts of frost and fire, trees birthing worlds, wolves swallowing the sun. Each carving was both prophecy and memory, for the North did not distinguish between the two. What had been would come again, and what was to come had already been. By the time the sun rose, Kratos stood at the edge of a vast fjord. Ice floated upon the black water, the waves slow and deliberate. In the distance, something glimmered, a bridge immense and spectral, stretching across the sea like a path of light. Its surface shimmered with runes that pulsed like stars. It was not built by mortal hands. It was the work of gods. He stood there a long time, the wind tugging at his cloak, the frost clinging to his beard. The North had shown him its face, not of war, but of memory, not of thrones, but of cycles. He had walked into a world that remembered before it ruled, that whispered before it spoke. A world where gods slept not in arrogance, but in waiting. And though he did not know it yet, the road ahead would carry him beyond silence, to the place where the past meets prophecy, and where a son would learn from his father what even gods must one day understand. That power means nothing without restraint, and that peace, though fragile, is worth the weight of eternity. The wind rose again, cold and clear. Kratos turned his face toward the mountains. The chains at his wrists glowed faintly, and for the first time in many years they did not burn. He began to walk. And far behind him, in the depths of the river, the great serpent moved, slow, vast, eternal, humming the song of beginnings. The first sound was laughter, faint, fleeting, and human. It drifted through the forest like smoke, curling between the pines, breaking the long silence that had followed the end of gods. Kratos stopped when he heard it. He had not heard such a sound in years, light, unguarded, born not from triumph but from wonder. It belonged to a child. The forest around him was heavy with snow. Branches sagged beneath its weight, and the light that pierced through the canopy came soft and gold, like the last breath of an evening sun. For a moment, the world felt warm. The air shimmered with the scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a boy was calling out to something, perhaps to the wind, perhaps to the trees. Kratos followed the sound. He found the boy kneeling beside a stag, its coat dark and its antlers rimmed with frost. The creature was dying, its breath slow and shallow, its eyes wide but peaceful. The boy's hands trembled as he whispered to it, words not of command but of comfort. The language was old, one that Kratos did not know, yet he understood its intent. The forest, too, seemed to listen. Even the wind stilled. When the boy saw him, he did not flinch. He looked up, eyes bright and unafraid, the color of clear sky after a storm. "He's hurt," the boy said softly, as though explaining the obvious, "but he's not afraid." Kratos stood in silence for a moment, watching the animal's final breath fade into the air. He had seen death take countless forms, swift, violent, merciful, cruel, but this one was gentle, almost sacred. The stag's body sank into the snow as though returning to the earth's embrace. The boy bowed his head. "You should not mourn," Kratos said quietly. The boy looked up at him, frowning slightly. "Why not?" "Because the forest does not mourn," he answered. "It remembers." The boy nodded, though his eyes lingered on the still form before him. "Then I will remember too." There was no fear in him, only curiosity, that tender defiance that belongs to youth. Kratos saw it in his face and felt a strange ache stir within his chest. The boy was not of Olympus, nor of Sparta. His voice carried no echo of gods, only the simple truth of those who live close to the earth. They walked together to the edge of the clearing. The boy carried a small bow, its wood worn smooth by use, the string humming faintly with runes. His movements were careful but certain, the gait of one who had been taught to listen to the land. Kratos followed in silence, studying him the way one studies a memory too precious to touch. When they reached the cabin nestled among the trees, smoke rose gently from its chimney. The air smelled of firewood and pine resin. Inside, the walls were lined with carvings, animals, runes, and what appeared to be fragments of stories etched into bark and bone. A woman's touch lingered here, soft but precise. The boy paused at the door. "She's gone," he said quietly. Kratos did not ask who. He already knew. He stepped inside. The hearth still burned, though faintly. A bundle of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, and beside the fire lay a single shroud, folded neatly. The weight in the air was not sorrow but reverence, the calm of a life well lived, a life that had known both love and loss. The boy moved to the table and placed his bow upon it. His hands shook only once before he steadied them. "She told me to burn her," he said, "to take her ashes to the highest peak in all the realms." His voice wavered, not from fear, but from the enormity of the task. "Will you help me?" Kratos looked at him, really looked. The boy's face was still soft, but his eyes held something old, something aware. There was a strength there that did not come from power, but from the quiet acceptance of pain. He thought of his own son, the one whose laughter he could not recall without feeling the burn of regret, the one lost to the flames of his own making. He nodded once. "I will help you." The boy smiled faintly, relief flickering across his face like dawn breaking through mist. He began to gather what little they would need: provisions, arrows, a single cloak. Kratos watched in silence. The air outside thickened with snow and the forest darkened as though night had arrived early to listen. They set out before dawn. The path wound upward through the forest, where frost clung to every branch and the ground whispered beneath their steps. The boy spoke often, of his mother, of the spirits in the woods, of the creatures that watched from the shadows. Kratos answered little, but listened always. At one point the boy asked, "Do you think the gods still watch us?" Kratos did not answer at first. The memory of Olympus flickered like a dying flame behind his eyes. "They watch," he said at last, "but they no longer decide." The boy nodded thoughtfully, as though this was a truth he had long suspected. "Good," he said. "Then we can choose our own path." The simplicity of it struck Kratos harder than any blade. He looked at the boy, this child born into a world that no longer bent beneath divine will, and saw, perhaps for the first time, what the end of Olympus had truly meant. It had not been a destruction, but a release. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley. The view stretched far, snow-covered forests, frozen rivers, and, in the distance, a mountain that rose higher than the clouds, its peak wrapped in mist. The boy pointed toward it. "That's where we're going." Kratos said nothing. The mountain loomed vast and unyielding, yet there was something familiar in its shape, not in its stone, but in its purpose. A journey to the peak, a burden carried in silence, a promise to keep. They descended into the valley as the sun began to sink. The light turned the snow to gold, and the trees whispered with the sound of distant wings. The boy walked ahead, his steps light, his breath visible in the chill air. Kratos followed, his own footsteps deep and steady, each one marking the passage of a man who had once carried the weight of gods, and now carried something far greater, the fragile hope of beginning again. When night came, they made camp beside a frozen lake. The boy slept quickly, exhaustion softening his features. Kratos sat awake, staring into the fire. The flames danced like ghosts, red, gold, and fleeting. He reached out his hand, and for a moment the warmth reminded him of something he could not name. He looked at the boy, sleeping peacefully, and understood the strange rhythm that now beat in his chest. It was not rage, it was not guilt. It was something gentler, something he had not felt since before the ashes touched his skin. It was care. He turned his gaze to the stars above, the same stars that had watched him climb Olympus, the same that now watched him kneel beside his son. And in their silent light, he thought he could almost hear her voice again, the woman who had once told him that even gods could learn to love. The fire crackled softly, the snow fell without sound, And somewhere in the dark, the forest sighed as if the world itself, after so much war and sorrow, was finally learning how to rest. The days grew longer as they journeyed northward. Snow turned to mist, and the rivers thawed into threads of silver that wound through the forest floor. The boy walked ahead most mornings, bow slung over his shoulder, his laughter echoing through the trees like birdsong. Kratos followed a few steps behind, silent as the shadows that watched from the woods. They spoke little at first. The boy, still learning the rhythm of grief, would ask questions that hung in the air unanswered. What were the gods of your land like? Were they kind? Were they cruel? Kratos would pause before answering, and often silence became his only reply. For how could he speak of Olympus, of the cruelty dressed as glory, of the power that had devoured mercy? How could he explain that even gods could die of pride? The boy, though young, understood more than he let on. He had seen the heaviness in Kratos' eyes, the way his hands lingered too long at the hilt of his blade, the quiet way he looked at the horizon as if expecting ghosts. He did not press further. Children know when silence is not empty, but sacred. As they moved deeper into the wild, the world began to shift. The forests grew denser, the air thick with the hum of unseen things. There were whispers among the trees, not words but impressions, the sigh of roots, the breath of old spirits. Sometimes the wind would change direction without warning, and the boy would stop, his eyes searching the shadows. "The forest is watching us," he would say. Kratos would nod, but not in fear. The forest watched everything. They crossed rivers frozen beneath thin ice, climbed ridges crowned with ravens, and slept beneath auroras that painted the sky in ribbons of green and violet. The boy often asked about the stars, their names, their shapes, their meanings, and Kratos, though uncertain, would answer with the little he remembered from another world. "That one," he would say, pointing to a bright flame near the horizon, "was once called Orion." The boy would stare in wonder. "Do you think the same stars watch both lands?" Kratos looked up. "They watch everything," he said, "even those who wish not to be seen." One evening, as they followed a trail along a frozen river, they came upon a stone circle half buried in snow. Runes glowed faintly upon its edge, and in its center burned a fire that gave no smoke. The boy approached, curious, and knelt to touch one of the stones. His fingers brushed the rune, and the world seemed to shift. The fire brightened. The air grew thick. Voices filled the clearing, faint at first, then rising like a chorus sung from the depths of time. Kratos stepped forward, hand reaching for the boy's shoulder, but stopped when he saw what the boy saw. Figures moved within the flame. Not gods, but spirits, shimmering shapes woven from light and smoke. They danced slowly, their movements calm and solemn. The boy's eyes widened. "Who are they?" he whispered. Kratos watched as one of the spirits lifted its head and spoke in a voice older than language. Its tone was not wrathful but weary. "We are those who remain between breath and memory, the keepers of what was promised and lost. You walk upon a world that remembers its makers." The boy turned to Kratos. "Are they gods?" "No," Kratos said quietly. "They are what comes after." The spirit continued, its form shifting like firelight. "The old order crumbles, and from its ashes rises the question that binds all realms: who will inherit what the gods left undone?" The fire dimmed, and with it the voices faded. The air stilled once more. The boy knelt beside the stones, his brow furrowed in thought. "Do they mean us?" Kratos said nothing. He looked at the circle, at the ancient runes carved by hands that believed in eternity, and felt the faint stir of something he had long buried: purpose. That night, they camped near the riverbank. The boy spoke quietly as he cleaned his bow. "I think they were right," he said. "Maybe it's not about gods anymore. Maybe it's about what we do when they are gone." Kratos looked into the fire. The flames danced like the spirits they had seen, fragile, flickering, alive. "The gods believed themselves eternal," he said at last. "But nothing endures forever, not even power. What remains is choice." The boy nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Then we must choose well. Silence followed, the good kind, the kind that means understanding has taken root. Above them, the stars shimmered faintly, distant but steady. Days passed. They crossed into higher ground, where the trees gave way to tundra and the sky widened into a boundless grey. The wind was sharp here, carrying with it the distant cry of wolves. The boy moved closer to Kratos as the cold deepened. "Do you think we'll reach the mountain soon?" "We will," Kratos said, "but the mountain is not what we think it is." The boy frowned, puzzled, but said nothing more. As night fell, they found shelter within a shallow cave. Frost crept along the walls like pale vines, and the sound of dripping water echoed softly. The boy huddled beside the fire, half asleep. Kratos sat near the entrance, his gaze fixed on the storm beyond. The wind howled through the pass, and in its cry he thought he heard whispers, faint, broken words carried from another age. A woman's voice, soft and distant, like the echo of a dream. "Protect the boy." He turned, eyes narrowing, but the cave was empty save for the sleeping child and the slow, patient fire. For a moment, he let himself believe it had been her, his wife, the one whose ashes they now carried. Perhaps even now she walked beside them, unseen, guiding them toward the summit. When dawn came, they continued their ascent. The boy spoke less now. The air grew thinner, the ground steeper. Snow swirled around them like ghosts of breath. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, not the sound of a storm, but of something stirring. By midday, they reached a high ridge overlooking the valley. The boy stopped, breath clouding in the air, eyes wide. "Look," he whispered. Below them, the world seemed to open. The forests and rivers spread like veins of silver and shadow. In the distance, a great serpent moved, its body coiling through the fjords, its scales glinting beneath the pale sun. It moved slowly, deliberately, like the shifting of continents. The boy stared in awe. "He's beautiful," he said. "What is he?" Kratos watched in silence. "The world serpent." He murmured. "Yermungandr." The boy turned to him. "Is he dangerous?" "All things are," Kratos said, "even those who mean no harm." They stood together in silence, watching the great serpent disappear into the mist. The boy's expression softened, a mixture of fear and wonder. "Do you think he knows us?" Kratos hesitated. "He knows everything." The wind rose again, cold and clear. The world below seemed to hum with quiet life, as though the serpent's passing had awakened something long asleep. Kratos looked at the boy beside him and saw, for the first time, the faint reflection of a destiny larger than either of them, a thread that stretched from the ruins of Olympus to the snows of this new world. And though he did not yet understand it, he knew this. The story of gods was not over. It had only changed its language. They turned toward the mountain once more, their shadows long upon the snow. The boy walked slightly ahead, his bow at his side, his spirit unbroken. Kratos followed, his chains heavy yet quiet, their metal cold against his skin. Above them, the northern lights flickered, not as fire, but as memory, the colors of creation itself weaving once more through the fabric of the sky. And beneath that silent glow, the boy and the god walked together, one learning the world, the other learning himself, their footsteps marking the beginning of something the heavens would one day call redemption. The first time the serpent spoke, the earth itself seemed to draw breath. It began as a tremor beneath the ice, faint and distant, like thunder muffled by snow. The trees shuddered, their branches heavy with frost. The river slowed, its current thickening as though time itself hesitated to move forward. And then came the sound, deep, ancient, rolling through the valleys and mountains with the weight of creation. Atreus froze where he stood. His bow slipped slightly from his fingers, the string humming softly in the still air. "Father," he whispered, his voice small against the enormity of the sound. Kratos said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the fjord opened into a wide basin of mist and water. The surface trembled. The mountains echoed with the sound of shifting stone. and from beneath the ice, the world began to rise. The serpent's head emerged first, vast, glimmering, carved in scales that shimmered with the light of ages. His eyes, pale as starlight, turned slowly toward them. His body stretched for miles, each movement a tide unto itself, rippling through the sea, shaking the cliffs. The snow fell in spirals, disturbed by his awakening. Atreus took a step forward, wonder overtaking fear. "He's huge," he breathed. "Bigger than anything I've ever seen." Kratos placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not approach," but the serpent had already seen them. His gaze fixed upon the boy, and in that moment, the air grew warm, not with fire, but with recognition. The creature opened his mouth, and when he spoke, the language that poured forth was older than gods, older than the stars that first marked the sky. The sound was not speech as mortals knew it. It was vibration, a low, sonorous hum that trembled through the bones, through the snow, through the world itself. The trees bent toward it, the river stilled, even the wind paused as though listening. Atreus gasped and took a step back. "What did he say?" Kratos' eyes narrowed. "I do not know." But deep within him, something stirred, an echo, faint and familiar. The serpent's voice was not a threat, it was a memory. It carried the weight of everything the world had forgotten and everything it had yet to become. The serpent watched them a moment longer, then lowered his great head. His breath rolled across the shore like fog, cool and heavy with the scent of water and iron. Atreus stared, unblinking. Then, slowly, the creature sank beneath the ice once more, the sea closing over him with a sigh. The sound faded, and the world was quiet again. The boy exhaled shakily. "Did he mean to scare us?" "No," Kratos said. "He meant to speak." "To us?" Kratos looked out over the water. "Perhaps not to us, perhaps to what we carry." They stood in silence for a long while, watching the ripples fade into stillness. The serpent's presence lingered, not as fear, but as awareness, the sense that they had been seen by something far greater than gods. As they resumed their journey, the forest seemed changed. The air hummed faintly, as though charged with memory. The boy glanced back more than once, expecting to see the great form rise again from the water, but it did not. The serpent slept once more, its body hidden beneath the depths, its dreams winding through the roots of the world. "You think he's good?" Atreus asked after a time. "Good and evil are words for men," Kratos said. "The serpent is neither, he is truth, and truth does not take sides." Atreus frowned thoughtfully. "Then what is he?" Kratos glanced at him, his voice low, the world remembering itself. They continued north, the mountains rising higher with every mile. The path grew narrow, winding between cliffs that glittered with frost and shadow. The sky burned pale above them, streaked with light that never quite faded into day. They passed villages long abandoned, houses half buried in snow, their doorways marked with runes. The boy would stop sometimes to trace the symbols, reading what he could. "These say, waiting, and this one, return." Kratos looked down at him. "For whom do they wait?" The boy hesitated. "I don't know, maybe for the gods." "Then they will wait forever," Kratos said softly. They came upon a frozen lake before dusk. Its surface was smooth as glass, the reflection of the sky rippling across it like liquid silver. Atreus ran ahead, his laughter bright against the stillness. Kratos followed slowly, his boots creaking against the ice. When he reached the center, he felt it again, that hum deep beneath the surface. The heartbeat of the world. The boy stopped and turned toward him. "Do you hear it?" "Yes." "What is it?" "The same as before." "The serpent," Kratos nodded. "He sleeps beneath this world. And when he dreams, the land moves." The boy knelt and pressed his palm against the ice. The vibration ran up his arm, through his chest, into his breath. "It feels alive," he whispered, "like the world is breathing." Kratos looked down at him, his eyes thoughtful. "Then listen well. All things breathe, even the ones that do not speak." That night, they made camp by the lake. The aurora shimmered above them, bands of light shifting like slow fire. The boy watched in awe while Kratos tended the small flame between them. The sound of the serpent's distant hum still lingered, threading through the silence like the rhythm of a heartbeat too vast to name. "Do you think he'll wake again?" Atreus asked. "Yes," Kratos said, "when the time comes." "What time?" Kratos stared into the fire. "When the world forgets to listen." Atreus frowned but did not press. He lay back on the snow, watching the sky pulse with green and violet. After a moment he whispered, "Do you think he's lonely?" Kratos paused. "Perhaps." The boy smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's why he spoke. Maybe he just wanted someone to hear him." Kratos looked at him, the flickering firelight reflecting in his eyes. He thought of Olympus, of the gods who had spoken only to be obeyed. He thought of all the voices lost to pride and thunder. And then he thought of the serpent, a creature too vast for words, whose voice was the voice of the world itself. "Then let us listen," Kratos said quietly. The wind moved gently through the trees. The lake shimmered. Somewhere beneath the ice, the serpent stirred, its body turning slowly in its endless sleep. The sound that rose from the depths was soft this time, not a warning, not a roar, but a sigh. The sigh of a being who dreams not of conquest, but of remembrance. And as the boy and the god sat beside their fire, the stars above them shifted, as though the heavens themselves were leaning closer, listening too. For the serpent's dream was not just his own. It was the dream of every world that had ever been, and everyone that would come again. The frost had not yet lifted when they reached the valley where the world bent inward, a hollow vast enough to hold an ocean yet still as a breath before dawn. The air shimmered faintly, mist clung to the trees in long, silvery veils. There was a stillness here, but it was not silence. It was listening, the same deep awareness that lives in the pause between a heartbeat and the next. Kratos felt it before the boy did. The ground pulsed beneath their feet, soft, rhythmic, like the slow turn of an unseen tide. The wind hummed through the frozen branches, carrying a low vibration that did not belong to weather. The serpent was near again. Atreus stopped, his small hand brushing against the frost-covered bark of a tree. "He's waking," he whispered. "I can feel it." Kratos nodded, his voice steady. "He feels us too." They stepped into the clearing where the river widened into a vast mirror of ice and mist. The horizon quivered as if reality itself had drawn a long, weary breath. The water rippled once, then stilled. The boy stood at its edge, his reflection trembling beside his father's. Then came the voice. It began as a murmur, low and resonant, swelling until it filled the sky. The mountains answered it with a long, echoing groan, and the snow lifted from the ground in swirling arcs. The great serpent rose once more from the water, slow, deliberate, endless. His scales caught the pale light of the dawn, glowing with faint runes that pulsed like the rhythm of thought. Atreus took a step forward, eyes wide. "He's calling us." Kratos placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, he is calling something through us." The serpent's gaze turned toward them. His eyes burned with the stillness of eternity, not wrath, not mercy, but knowledge so vast it could no longer speak in words. He moved his head closer, the air vibrating with the force of his presence. The boy's hair lifted in the current of his breath. When he spoke, the world shook. His language was not sound, but resonance, ancient chords that spoke directly to the soul. Atreus pressed his hands to his ears, but the voice entered through his chest, his blood, his breath. He gasped, his eyes going distant, unfocused, filled with light. "Father," he murmured, trembling. "He's showing me something." Kratos steadied him, holding him firm as the serpent's song deepened. The world around them blurred, the sky turning to fire, the trees to shadow. Images flickered through the light, a mountain crowned in flame, a tree whose roots wrapped around all realms, a wolf chasing the sun, a god kneeling beside a boy. The serpent's voice grew softer now, more like thought than sound. Atreus spoke the words as they formed within him. "He says the end has happened before, that it will happen again. That time is not a line but a circle." Kratos' brow furrowed. "Ragnarok." Atreus nodded slowly, his breath unsteady. He says the world will end not in fire but in forgetting. When gods no longer remember what they are, and men no longer remember why they were made. The serpent exhaled, and the mist curled around them like smoke. His voice faded into a low hum, the rhythm slowing. Atreus blinked as though waking from a dream and stumbled. Kratos caught him. "Are you harmed?" The boy shook his head. "No, just heavy." He looked out over the water where the serpent's form was beginning to fade again. He said we are part of it, that we were always part of it. Kratos' eyes followed the ripples spreading across the lake. "The cycle," he murmured. "Even the gods are bound to it." "But can we change it?" Atreus asked. For a long moment, Kratos said nothing. The wind moved softly through the clearing, lifting the snow in thin, drifting spirals. "If the gods could not," he said at last, "perhaps we must." The serpent sank once more beneath the water. The last of his glow vanished into the depths, leaving behind only the whisper of his hum, a lullaby for the dying and the living alike. The air stilled. The frost glittered like dust caught in sunlight. Atreus sank to his knees beside the water, staring at the reflection of the sky. He said, "There's a tree," he whispered. "A tree that holds the worlds together. Its roots touch every realm and its branches reach into forever." Kratos nodded slowly. "Yggdrasil." The boy turned to him, eyes bright. He said it remembers everything, every god, every death, every choice, even us. Kratos looked down at his hands, at the faint glow of the chains beneath his skin. "Then the tree knows my sins as well." "Maybe it doesn't see them as sins," the boy said softly. "Maybe it sees them as lessons." The words settled between them like snow. Kratos said nothing, but something in his gaze softened. The boy's innocence carried wisdom even gods had forgotten. They walked from the clearing as the day grew long. The serpent's presence lingered in the rhythm of their steps, in the slow beat of their hearts. The land seemed to move with them, rivers bending their flow, branches swaying gently in the wind. The world had acknowledged them now, not as trespassers, but as part of its endless story. As dusk fell, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the great tree spread its canopy, vast and luminous, its roots glowing faintly through the mist. It was not made of wood, but of light woven through the fabric of creation. Every branch pulsed with memory, every leaf whispered of what had been and what might come again. Atreus stood in awe. "It's beautiful," he said. "It feels alive." Kratos' voice was low. "It is life itself." They descended toward it, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. The wind around them hummed softly, the echo of the serpent's song blending with the heartbeat of the tree. It was as if all creation breathed together here, balanced between endings and beginnings. When they reached the base of the great trunk, Atreus placed his hand upon the bark. A faint warmth pulsed beneath it, steady and calm. "He's here," the boy said. "The serpent, he's part of it." Kratos touched the bark as well. The vibration ran through him, gentle yet immense. For the first time, he felt not rage, not burden, but belonging. The gods of Olympus had ruled through fear and thunder. But here, in the quiet heart of the north, divinity was not power, it was memory. The boy turned to him. He said something else before he went back to sleep. Kratos met his eyes. "What did he say?" Atreus hesitated, then whispered. "He said that even the gods must learn to forgive themselves." The words lingered in the cold air, soft as breath. Kratos looked out across the valley, where the tree's branches reached toward the fading sun. For the first time in a lifetime, he allowed the stillness to reach him, the quiet truth that even the gods could change, that even he could. As the light dimmed, they sat beneath the tree's roots, the hum of the serpent weaving with the rustle of the wind. Atreus leaned against his father, his small hand resting against the cold metal of the chains. "They're warm," he said softly. Kratos looked down, startled. The chains, long cursed and cold, pulsed faintly with warmth, not from fire but from life. He placed his hand over his son's. The world was silent now, save for the slow, steady breath of creation. Above them, the aurora shimmered, green and gold, the the colors of dawn reborn. For the first time since the fall of Olympus, Kratos closed his eyes without fear, and somewhere beneath the ice, the serpent smiled in its sleep. The cold came softly at first, like a sigh against the trees, a whisper carried by unseen wings. It brushed through the forests and valleys, stealing the color from leaves, dimming the warmth in the rivers, and turning breath into mist. The north was changing. Its silence had grown thicker, older, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Kratos and Atreus felt it long before they saw it. The air grew heavy with frost, even beneath the pale sun. The snow that fell no longer melted. It lingered, each flake glowing faintly in the dim light. Birds no longer sang at dawn. The deer that once watched from the woods had vanished. Even the wind had lost its song, replaced by a low hum that carried through the valleys like the memory of thunder. They walked for days through this gathering stillness, the boy's voice the only sound that dared to rise above the cold. "Father," Atreus said one morning, his breath a thin silver thread in the air, "the trees are dying." Kratos looked at the frost creeping along the bark, veins of white splitting through the dark wood. He touched it with his hand, and the cold bit into his skin. "They sleep," he said. "The world sleeps before it remembers how to wake." But he knew it was more than sleep. This was something deeper, an old magic, slow and deliberate, spreading through the earth like an approaching tide. By the third night, the stars themselves had dimmed. The aurora that once painted the sky in ribbons of green had faded to a pale gray. The fire at their camp sputtered weakly, no matter how much wood they fed it. Atreus huddled close, his face flushed with the cold. "It's different," he whispered, "not like the other winters." Kratos nodded. His eyes, sharp as stone, reflected the dying light. "It is the beginning of something." The boy tilted his head. "The beginning of what, Fimbulwinter?" Kratos said softly, the word heavy, almost reverent. "The long frost before the end of all things." Atreus stared into the fire, his eyes wide. "The end like Ragnarok." Kratos did not answer at once. He watched the flames flicker and twist, struggling against the cold that sought to smother them. "The end," he said finally, "is a story the world tells itself when it forgets how to begin again." The boy frowned, tracing patterns in the snow beside him. "Then maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's just another sleep." Kratos looked at him, this child who spoke like one who had lived many lives. "Perhaps," he said. They pressed onward the next day. The snow deepened, blanketing the world in silence. Their footsteps left no sound, no echo. The mountains loomed closer, their peaks sharp against the dull sky. Along the path, they found carvings etched into stone, ancient runes frozen in place, their meaning half erased by ice. Atreus paused to study one of them. "This one says skirl," he murmured, "and this one hattie, wolves." Kratos looked toward the horizon. "The sons of Fenrir," Atreus shivered, "the ones who chase the sun and moon. And one day," Kratos said, "they will catch them." The boy looked up. "Is that when the world ends?" Kratos's gaze lingered on the gray horizon, where the faint shape of the sun struggled to break through the mist. "No," he said quietly. "That is when it begins again." They walked on. The world grew stranger with every mile. Frost bloomed across the rivers, turning water to glass. Trees cracked beneath the weight of ice. The sky hung heavy, pale, and endless. And through it all, the wind whispered, not in words, but in feeling, in the ancient rhythm of prophecy. That night, they took shelter in the ruins of an old temple. Its roof had long since fallen, and frost covered every stone. A faded mural stretched across one wall, a great wolf devouring the sun, its jaws wide, the light spilling into shadow. At its feet, smaller figures fought and fell, their bodies half erased by time. Atreus stood before it, tracing the outlines with his hand. "It's all happening," he said softly, "just like the stories." Kratos watched him. "Stories are not destiny," he said, "but the serpent said time is a circle." Kratos's eyes hardened. "Then circles can be broken." The boy turned toward him. "You sound like you don't believe in prophecy." I have seen prophecy, Kratos said. It bends beneath the weight of those who live. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled weakly in the center of the temple, its light flickering against the stone. Outside, the wind moaned like a voice lost to time. When Atreus finally spoke again, his voice was small. Do you think Mother knew? Kratos looked into the flames. She knew many things. She told me not to be afraid, the boy said. Even if the world ended, she was wise. The boy nodded, his eyes glistening with reflection. Do you think the world ends for everyone? Kratos looked at him, his voice low. The world ends each day and begins again with every breath. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow drifted through the cracks in the walls, swirling like pale ghosts. The boy leaned against his father, his small frame shivering beneath the furs. Kratos rested a hand on his shoulder, not to shield, but to anchor. When morning came, the world was unrecognizable. The sky had turned the color of iron. The rivers had frozen solid, and even the mountains seemed to sleep beneath the weight of frost. In the distance, the faint sound of howling echoed through the cold, long, mournful, endless. Atreus looked toward the sound. The wolves, he whispered. Kratos nodded. They run closer now. But if they catch the sun, Kratos cut him off softly, then the world will learn how to see in the dark. The boy fell silent, the thought turning over in his mind. They began their descent from the temple, their footsteps muffled by snow. Each sound felt sacred, each breath a prayer. The frost clung to their clothes like memory, and the light that filtered through the clouds seemed older than the sun itself. As they walked, Atreus turned to him again. If Fimbulwinter is the beginning of the end, what comes after? Kratos looked ahead, where the mountains split and the horizon opened like the pages of an unwritten story. The wind brushed past them, carrying with it a faint echo, the hum of something vast stirring beneath the ice. What comes after, he said, is what we choose to build. They reached the edge of a frozen lake, the surface dark and still. Beneath the ice, faint lights pulsed, slow, steady, alive. Atreus knelt to touch it, his breath fogging the surface. It's beautiful, he said. It looks like it's breathing. Kratos stood beside him, his voice quiet. The world does not die easily. They lingered there, the snow falling around them in soft, endless silence. Somewhere beyond sight, the wolves ran their eternal chase. The stars dimmed and flared again. The air hummed with the rhythm of something vast and unseen, the slow, patient breath of destiny itself. And though the cold grew sharper, though the world seemed to retreat into frost and dream, a warmth lingered still. Not from fire, not from gods, but from two hearts walking side by side, learning how to survive the silence together. The boy looked up at his father, his eyes bright with the reflection of the frozen sky. Then Fimbulwinter isn't the end, he said softly. Kratos met his gaze. No, it is the waiting between heartbeats. The wind rose, lifting the snow into a slow spiral. The world seemed to pause once more, as if listening to their words. And beneath the ice, deep in the unseen dark, something vast stirred, not death, not doom, but the quiet promise of a beginning yet to come. The frost deepened as the days grew long and indistinguishable, each one fading into the next like the echo of a dream that refused to end. The sun no longer rose fully above the mountains. It hung at the edge of the world, pale and distant, as if watching from another realm. The forests had turned to bone and silence. Each step Kratos and Atreus took crunched softly beneath the weight of the snow, and even their breath seemed to move slower, as though the air itself had thickened with time. The north was quiet, too quiet, but the silence was not absence. It was waiting. They walked through a narrow pass where cliffs loomed on either side like the ribs of an ancient beast. The boy's hood was drawn up against the wind, his bow slung across his back, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "It's colder," he said. His voice was soft, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. "Colder than before." Kratos glanced up. Frost clung to his beard, his armor dim under the pale light. "It will grow colder still." Atreus frowned. How can it? Everything's already frozen. The cold does not stop when it claims the world. Kratos said, "It stops when it remembers why it came." The boy fell silent, turning the words over in his mind as they climbed higher into the mountains. The storm began that night. It did not come with thunder or fire, but as a wall of white that consumed everything in its path. The wind screamed through the ravines, pulling at their cloaks, swallowing their footprints as soon as they were made. Snow spun in endless spirals, each flake glowing faintly as if carrying a spark of memory. The world vanished into the storm's endless breath. Kratos led them toward the shelter of a ruined watchtower, its stones half buried in ice. They forced the door open and stepped inside, the wind dying behind them. The room smelled of frost and old smoke. Runes carved into the walls glowed faintly, casting soft light upon the frozen floor. Atreus rubbed his hands together for warmth. "What is this place?" Kratos looked around. "A shrine to the gods of this land." The boy ran his fingers over the runes. "They are prayers, not for strength or victory, for mercy." He turned toward his father. "Do gods ever show mercy?" Kratos' gaze was distant. "Only when they have learned pain." The boy lowered his head. "Then maybe that's why this winter came. Maybe it's the world remembering its pain." Kratos said nothing. The fire they built barely held against the cold, but its light filled the room with a soft, trembling glow. Snow hissed against the windows, and beyond the walls the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. Atreus sat beside his father, drawing shapes in the frost. "When the serpent spoke," he said time was a circle, that what's coming has already been. Kratos nodded. "The world remembers itself in cycles, creation, silence, renewal." The boy looked at him. "Then this winter, it's part of that." "Yes, it is the quiet before the new song." Atreus leaned closer to the fire, his eyes reflecting the flame. "Then what happens if we don't survive the quiet?" Kratos' expression softened. "Then the song will still go on. We may not hear it, but it will play." The storm outside deepened. The walls groaned beneath its weight. And then, through the howl of the wind, they heard it faint, melodic, not quite human. A voice, soft as snow falling, weaving through the storm. Atreus lifted his head. "Father, do you hear that?" Kratos rose slowly. The sound was clearer now, not the voice of the serpent, nor of any mortal. It was a woman's voice, distant yet familiar, singing in a language neither of them knew. The melody wound through the cracks in the stone, carried by the storm. Atreus stood. "It's her," he whispered. "Mother." Kratos' jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call it a trick of memory, but the sound reached him too, a voice that lived in both grief and love, singing not to the living or the dead, but to the space between. The boy moved toward the door. "She's calling us." Kratos caught his arm. "It is a memory, not a call." Atreus looked up at him, tears shining in his eyes. "Then why does it sound like she's waiting?" The storm outside howled louder. The voice wove through it, clearer now, stronger, as if the world itself carried her song. The boy struggled free and pushed open the door. Wind and snow surged in, nearly blinding them. She stood at the edge of the storm, not in flesh, but in light, her form flickering like flame behind frost. Her eyes were kind, sorrowful, endless. She said no words, but the world seemed to pause around her, listening. Atreus stepped forward. "Mother." The apparition smiled faintly, then looked toward Kratos. Her lips moved, but her voice came through the air itself, soft, carrying the weight of time. "The winter comes not to destroy, but to prepare. The cold cleanses the roots so new life can rise. You must carry warmth through the storm, or the world will not remember spring." Then the light dimmed, folding into the snow, and she was gone. The storm broke apart, its wind slowing, the snow falling gently once more. Atreus stood trembling, his breath shallow. "She was real," he said. "I felt her." Kratos placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was low, steady. "So did I." They remained in the doorway for a long time, watching the snow drift down in slow spirals. The world seemed softer now, still frozen, but not dead. In the distance, light shimmered faintly through the clouds. The next morning, they continued their climb. The air was still cold, but no longer biting. The frost that clung to the trees now sparkled like crystal in the rising sun. The silence had changed. It was no longer waiting for the end, but for a beginning. As they walked, Atreus looked up. "Do you think Fimbulwinter ever truly ends?" Kratos' voice came like a deep breath. "No, it changes. Winter becomes memory. Memory becomes spring." The boy smiled faintly. Then maybe she was right. The cold isn't the end, it's the space before the beginning. Kratos looked at him, the faintest glimmer of warmth breaking through the frost in his eyes. And what we do within that space decides what the world becomes after. They walked on, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. The sky above them began to clear, and the light that touched the mountains was faint but golden, the first promise of a dawn that had not yet forgotten how to return. Far behind them, the storm's echo lingered, not as fury but as song, a song of renewal, a song of memory. And in the heart of that endless winter, father and son carried its warmth onward, a fragile, flickering light against the long night, enough to remind the sleeping world that spring still waited to be born. The world had grown quiet after the storm, but it was not peace that filled the air, it was anticipation. The snow still blanketed the land, yet beneath it, the earth stirred, restless, as if the frost itself was beginning to dream. The wind carried voices now, faint, elusive, not of mortals, but of watchers hidden in the folds of the sky. Kratos and Atreus walked through a valley ringed by mountains whose peaks glowed faintly beneath the pale sun. The boy's eyes darted from tree to tree, his breath rising in mist. "It feels different here," he said, "like we're being followed." Kratos did not answer. He had already seen them, dark shapes moving high above, circling with patient rhythm. Ravens, dozens of them, their feathers black against the snow, their eyes bright as polished stone. They flew in spirals, watching but never descending. "Odin's sight," Kratos murmured. Atreus frowned. "You mean the Allfather, the king of the gods?" "King," Kratos said, his tone edged with quiet disdain. "No god rules without debt." The boy looked up again, watching as one raven broke away from the others and landed on a distant rock, its head tilted. It croaked once, a sound too deliberate to be animal. "He's watching us right now. He always watches," Kratos said. They continued onward, the ravens following from above like shadows cast by thought. The boy's steps grew slower as the air thickened, the light dimming without clouds. Ahead, the forest opened into a plain of ice and stone, and there, rising from its center like a wound upon the world, stood a tree. It was vast, blackened, its bark etched with golden runes that pulsed faintly as though alive. The ground around it was scorched despite the snow. At its base lay a ring of cracked earth, steaming faintly where the frost refused to take hold. Atreus stopped. "What happened here?" Kratos' eyes narrowed. "Lightning." Before the boy could ask more, the air trembled. The sky darkened, not with clouds but with weight, the pressure of power descending. A low rumble rolled through the earth, and from the distance came a flash of light, too bright to belong to any storm. The sound followed, a roar, deep and rolling, shaking the very bones of the mountain. The ravens scattered, the snow leapt into the air. Atreus clutched his bow. "Father!" Kratos did not move. He knew that sound. He had heard it in another life, in another world, the laughter of thunder given form. From the horizon came the shape of a man, walking through the storm like a shadow born of lightning. His footsteps struck the ground with the weight of storms. His eyes burned with the dull red of heated iron. A hammer hung at his side, runes crawling across its surface like veins of fire. "Thor." Kratos said softly. Atreus' breath caught. "That's him." The thunder god stopped a short distance away, his massive frame haloed by arcs of light. His gaze swept over them both, lingering on Kratos, then softening almost imperceptibly as it fell on the boy. "The Ghost of Sparta," he said. His voice was low, heavy, carrying the resonance of the storm. I thought the cold would have broken you by now. Kratos stood silent. Thor smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. You bring the ash of one world into another. Tell me, Ghost, does your wrath ever sleep? Atreus stepped forward, but Kratos placed a hand on his shoulder. It sleeps, he said, and you should let it. Thor's grin faded. You talk like a god who believes in peace. I talk, Kratos said, like one who has buried too many gods. Lightning cracked in the distance, bright enough to paint the mountains in brief, violent light. The air stung with the scent of ozone. For a moment, neither spoke. Two storms caught in stillness. Atreus looked between them, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of history in the air, not his own, but that of the world itself. He knew that the man before them was not merely thunder. He was judgment, but before a fight could form, the wind shifted. The air grew thick with the scent of flowers, faint and sorrowful, an impossible contrast to the cold. From the shadows beyond the blackened tree, a voice rose, soft, melodic, weary. Enough. A woman stepped into the light, her presence carrying warmth that did not melt the snow, only softened it. Her hair was the color of honey touched by dusk, her eyes green as the earth before the frost. She walked between them without fear, her gaze steady, her movements deliberate. Freya, Kratos said quietly. She looked at him, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with something in between. You walk far from your dead, she said, and yet they follow you still. Atreus lowered his bow. You know us. Freya smiled faintly, but her eyes never left Kratos. I know him. The destroyer of one pantheon, the orphan of another, the man who kills gods and buries his own mercy beside them. The boy flinched at her words, but Kratos stood unmoved. And yet here I stand, he said. Yes, she said. That is the curse of gods. They always stand. Thor turned to her, impatience flashing in his gaze. You protect them. I protect balance, she said softly. And balance does not need your thunder, he scowled, lightning rippling across his shoulders. Careful, which? Freya's expression did not change. Careful is for those who fear endings. I have lived through mine. The silence that followed was deep, stretching beyond words. The sky above them flickered, the faint glow of dawn hidden behind clouds. Then Thor stepped back, the storm fading slowly around him. This isn't over, he said. It never is, Kratos replied. With a sound like breaking thunder, Thor vanished into the horizon, leaving only the faint scent of rain in the air. The ravens returned, circling once more above the ruins. Freya watched them fade, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. He watches everything now. She said, the All-Father grows restless. He feels the end creeping closer. The end has always been close, Kratos said. She looked at him, and for the first time her expression softened. Perhaps, she said, but this time it wears your shadow. Atreus stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing fear. Do you mean Ragnarok? Freya smiled sadly. Ragnarok is not a storm, it is a choice. She turned toward Kratos. You, of all beings, should know that every ending begins with a decision. The snow fell lightly between them. The world seemed to exhale, the weight of gods and prophecy settling over the land like mist. Go, she said at last. The mountain waits, and the world will not stay still for long. Kratos nodded. And you, Freya's eyes glimmered with something between sorrow and resolve. I remain. There are roots here I cannot leave behind. The boy hesitated, wanting to speak but not knowing how. Will we see you again? Freya looked at him and smiled, a small warmth against the cold. If the gods permit it, and if the world still remembers kindness. Then she turned and walked back into the forest, her form dissolving into the snow and light. Kratos and Atreus stood for a long time in the silence she left behind. Above them, the ravens circled once, then flew north, toward the unseen horizon. The boy looked up. Are all gods like that? Kratos watched the sky. No, he said quietly, but all gods believe they are. They began walking again, the sound of their steps echoing softly through the snow. The sky above flickered faintly with lightning, and somewhere beyond the clouds, a raven called out, its cry stretching into the endless cold, carrying the sound of the storm yet to come. And though the frost lay thick upon the earth, there was warmth still, the steady rhythm of two hearts walking forward beneath the watchful eyes of gods who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The sky had turned the color of smoke. It was neither day nor night, but something in between, a long twilight that clung to the mountains like memory. The snow fell softly, slow as breath, and the air carried that same strange stillness that always came before something vast was about to wake. They had left Freya's glade behind, but her words lingered. The Allfather grows restless. As they walked through the frozen fields, Atreus glanced upward at the black shapes circling far above. "He's watching again," the boy whispered. "The ravens." Kratos' gaze followed the movement of their wings, the way they glided without sound, their eyes glimmering faintly like embers caught in the dark. "He never stopped," the boy frowned. "If he knows where we are, why doesn't he just come himself?" Kratos' voice came low, heavy. "Because gods do not act until they are certain they cannot be wrong." They moved on, the path narrowing between cliffs of stone that gleamed with veins of ice. The wind wove through the crevices, carrying faint whispers, not words but impressions. The boy shivered and drew his cloak tighter. "It sounds like they're talking," he said. "They are," Kratos said quietly. "This land listens to itself." They walked until the cliffs opened into a clearing. In its center stood a statue, vast, broken, half buried in frost. The face was gone, shattered long ago, but the crown that remained bore the unmistakable marks of the Aesir. Atreus touched the base of the statue, brushing away snow. "He was one of them," he said. "One of Odin's." Kratos nodded. "All gods build monuments to their certainty. But someone broke this one." "Yes," Kratos said, "and the world was better for it." Before the boy could reply, the air changed. The wind stopped. The ravens above fell silent, and from the shadows beyond the clearing, a voice rose smooth, deep, and quiet as falling snow. "Better for whom? Ghost of Sparta." Atreus spun, his hand flying to his bow. But Kratos didn't move. His jaw tightened, his eyes steady on the shape that stepped forward from the mist. He was tall, not as massive as Thor, but more deliberate in his stillness. His robes were dark as ash, threaded with faint light that shimmered like starlight reflected on water. His eyes, one sharp, one dimmed, gleamed with intelligence that felt more like hunger. "Odin," Kratos said. The Allfather smiled faintly. "You know my name? Good, I dislike introductions." Atreus stared at him, awe and unease mingling in his chest. "You're the king of the gods." Odin's gaze drifted to the boy. "King, father, wanderer, liar, the words change, but the stories remain." His tone was almost kind, but his smile never reached his eyes. "And you must be the boy. The one the fates whisper about, the thread that ties two worlds together." Atreus's mouth opened, but no sound came. Kratos stepped slightly forward, his voice low. "You will not speak his name." Odin chuckled, not in mockery, but in amusement, still so protective. "You've learned nothing from the ashes you left behind." Kratos' hand flexed at his side. "Say what you came to say." Odin walked slowly around the statue's ruin, his hand brushing the frost. "The world turns whether we fight or sleep. You broke Olympus, tore its order from the heavens, and now you walk here, dragging your silence through the snow, pretending you have changed." He turned, his one bright eye fixing on Kratos. "But gods do not change. They only choose different ruins to stand upon." Kratos met his gaze, unflinching. "You are not the first to believe that." "No," Odin said softly, "but I may be the last." The air between them thickened. The boy could feel it. Two storms circling, neither striking, both aware of the other's weight. He took a small step back. Odin's expression softened, his tone turning almost gentle. "You seek peace, I'm told. A quiet life. The ashes of your wife carried to the mountain, the boy taught to hunt, to think, to dream. It's almost human." He tilted his head. But you know peace is a fragile lie. The world will not allow it. Not for you. Atreus's voice trembled. Why? Odin's eyes flicked toward him, and for a heartbeat, the boy felt as though he was staring into the endless depths of the cosmos itself. Because prophecy does not rest, little one, and your blood sings too loud for the fates to ignore. Kratos stepped between them, his voice like stone breaking. Enough, Odin smiled. As you wish. He turned his gaze upward where the ravens circled once more. But remember this, Ghost of Sparta, you cannot run from what is woven, you can only delay the threads tightening. The wind rose again, swirling snow between them. When it cleared, Odin was gone. The ravens scattered into the grey sky, their cries fading like echoes of thought. The boy stood silent for a long time, staring at the empty space where the god had stood. He knew everything, he whispered. About you, about me. Kratos' voice was quiet. He knows what he wants to know. Atreus looked up. Do you think he'll come again? Kratos' eyes lingered on the horizon. He already has. They left the clearing behind, their shadows long against the snow. The path wound upward through forests that glimmered faintly beneath the weak light of dusk. Yet there was something new in the air, a feeling of eyes watching not from above, but from within. When they made camp that night, the fire burned blue, the wood hissing softly as if alive. The boy stared into the flames. He didn't sound like I thought he would. How did you imagine him? Kratos asked. Louder, the boy said. Crueler, but he sounded tired. Kratos watched the firelight flicker across his son's face. Even gods grow weary of being gods. Atreus glanced at him. Do you? For a long time, Kratos didn't answer. The only sound was the wind whispering through the branches. Then he said quietly, I grow weary of forgetting what it means to be a man. The boy smiled faintly. Then maybe you haven't forgotten. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faint but clear like a warning. The boy looked toward the sound. Thor, Kratos nodded. The storm watches all who walk the old road. As the night deepened, the wind changed again, warmer now, carrying a faint fragrance of earth and rain. Freya's voice drifted through the dark like a memory. The All-Father grows restless. Kratos opened his eyes to the stars. The constellations were different here, yet somehow familiar, patterns repeating across worlds, as if the heavens themselves remembered. Beside him, Atreus slept, his face peaceful beneath the glow of the fire. The chains at Kratos' wrists shimmered faintly, the metal catching the starlight. He looked down at them and felt, for the first time, no anger, only understanding, for these were not the chains of a god's command anymore. They were the weight of choice, the mark of one who had carried war and chosen not to lift it again. He lay back against the cold earth, the sound of the storm fading into distance. And high above, Odin's ravens circled once more, black against the dim sky, two eyes watching, waiting, learning. The age of the old gods had not ended. It had only changed its face. The snow fell like memory. Soft, endless, unhurried, the kind of snow that did not erase footsteps but preserved them, as if the earth itself wanted to remember where they had walked. The sky above was grey and wide, its light diffused, timeless. Somewhere far behind them, the echoes of gods and storms had faded, leaving only the quiet rhythm of breath and the sound of boots pressing gently into the frost. Kratos and Atreus moved through a forest where the trees stood ancient and silent, the bark carved with runes too old for even the boy to read. The cold no longer bit as cruelly. It was gentler now, not the frost of endings, but of stillness. Atreus broke the silence first. It feels different, he said. Like the air's lighter, Kratos nodded. The storm has passed. The boy smiled faintly. For now. He walked ahead, tracing his hand along the rough bark of an old tree. Do you think the gods are still watching? Kratos looked up. Always, but their watching changes nothing. Atreus kicked softly at the snow, his breath curling in the air. I don't think Freya meant to scare us, he said. When she spoke of balance, maybe she just meant the world has to heal too. Kratos' eyes softened. Even gods forget how long healing takes. They continued until the forest thinned and opened to a wide valley. The sun hung low above the horizon, and for the first time in many months its light was gold again. The snow glittered where it touched, turning the landscape into a field of frozen fire. The boy stopped. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Kratos looked out over the valley. "It is peace," he said quietly, "for as long as peace can last." They made camp near a ridge where the wind sang softly through the stones. That night the stars returned, sharp and bright, as if newly born. Atreus lay back against the earth, his eyes fixed on the sky. "I think she'd like this place," he said softly. Kratos stirred the fire. "She would." The boy turned toward him. "Do you ever think about her?" Kratos' voice came like the low rumble of distant thunder. "Always." Atreus nodded. "I do too." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. The boy reached into his pack and took out a small wooden carving, a wolf worn smooth by his hands. "I started carving another one," he said shyly. "For her, so the forest remembers." Kratos watched him, his gaze steady, proud, and silent. "The forest remembers more than you think." The night deepened. The boy slept quickly, the wooden wolf clasped in his hand. Kratos sat awake, staring into the fire until the embers turned to ash. He had long thought himself beyond such stillness, beyond peace, beyond forgiveness. Yet here, beneath the returning stars, he felt something shift inside him, not release, not redemption, but acceptance. When dawn came, the sky was pale with mist. They climbed the ridge together, the snow crunching softly beneath their steps. At its peak, the world spread out before them, mountains layered in light, rivers glinting like threads of glass. And there, at the horizon, stood the mountain they had sought since the beginning, tall, unbroken, waiting. Atreus breathed in sharply. "It's close," Kratos nodded. "It is time." The ascent was long, but the mountain was kind to them. The wind was calm, and the ice gave way beneath their hands without struggle. As they climbed, the boy spoke little, though his eyes shone with the steady light of purpose. Kratos followed, his movements measured, his thoughts slow and heavy as the earth beneath his feet. By dusk, they reached the summit. The world below stretched endless and silent, the forests, the rivers, the valleys all wrapped in the pale hush of winter's last breath. Atreus knelt and opened the pouch he carried. Inside, the ashes glimmered faintly, light gray, touched with gold where the sun caught them. He looked up at his father. "Are you ready?" Kratos did not answer at once. His gaze lingered on the horizon, the edge where the world curved into mist. He took a slow breath. "Yes," he said finally. Together, they stepped to the edge of the peak. The wind lifted gently, swirling around them like a whisper. Atreus opened the pouch and poured the ashes into the air. The wind caught them, carrying them upward. They rose slowly, spinning into light, scattering into the sky. For a moment, they seemed to form shapes, a face, a smile, a memory. Then they were gone, dissolved into the golden mist of the setting sun. The boy's voice trembled. "Goodbye, Mother." Kratos stood beside him, silent. His hand rested on the boy's shoulder, heavy but gentle. He looked out over the world, at the light fading into dusk, at the quiet that followed. And for the first time in his life, the silence did not feel empty. Atreus wiped his eyes and smiled faintly. "She's free now," Kratos nodded. "So are we." They stood there for a long time, watching the last of the light fade. When darkness came, it did not fall like an ending, but like a blanket, soft, protective, whole. The boy spoke again, his voice small. "What do we do now?" Kratos looked at the stars, their light flickering steady above the frozen world. "We live," he said. "For her, for ourselves." The boy nodded. "Then we should keep walking." Kratos smiled, a small, quiet smile, almost hidden beneath the weight of his beard. "Yes," he said, "we should." They began their descent under a sky washed clean of clouds. The stars moved above them like slow fire, and the moon hung low, silver and calm. The boy hummed softly to himself, a tune he did not know but seemed to remember. Halfway down the mountain, Kratos paused and looked back. The The summit stood against the horizon, its peak glowing faintly where the last of the ashes had settled. For a moment, he thought he saw her again, standing in the light, smiling, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. The cold cleanses the roots so new life can rise. He bowed his head. Then let it rise. When he turned back, the boy was waiting. Together they walked into the valley where the first thaw of spring had begun, small, tender, almost imperceptible. The rivers cracked softly, the ice pulling back to reveal the faint shimmer of running water beneath. The air carried the scent of new earth, faint but alive. Atreus looked up, his breath catching. The snow is melting, Kratos nodded. The world remembers how to breathe again. They walked on, father and son, two travelers bound not by fate, but by choice. Behind them lay the ruins of gods and the long silence of vengeance. Before them stretched the quiet road of the living, and somewhere in that stillness, between the heartbeats of the world, a voice older than gods spoke softly through the wind. Peace is not given, Ghost of Sparta. It is made. Kratos closed his eyes, letting the words pass through him like warmth through frost. For the first time since the ashes had touched his skin, he did not resist them. He simply breathed. And as the morning light crept over the horizon, the Ghost of Sparta became, at last, just a man, walking beside his son, beneath a sky that had learned how to forgive. The thaw continued slowly, as if the world itself were relearning how to move. Each morning, the snow receded a little farther, revealing patches of green beneath the white, moss clinging to stone, the first blades of grass trembling beneath the breath of wind. The rivers ran louder now, their voices breaking the silence that had blanketed the world for so long. Kratos and Atreus walked beside one such river, its surface reflecting the pale light of a sun that seemed newly born. The boy skipped stones across it, watching each one bounce once, twice, before sinking. The sound was small, almost fragile, but it carried far in the quiet air. "Do you think she can see us?" Atreus asked. Kratos looked toward the horizon where the mountain rose like a shadow against the morning light. "She does not need to see us," he said. "She is in what we see." Atreus smiled faintly. "That sounds like something she would say." Kratos' eyes softened. "She said many things I did not hear until it was too late." The boy looked down at the river. "Then we should listen better this time." They walked until the sun began to sink again, turning the water gold. The valley ahead opened wide, filled with trees just beginning to bloom. Tiny white petals fell through the air, drifting across the thawing ground. The scent of earth and new life mingled with the faint chill of the passing frost. Atreus stopped and turned to his father. "Is it over now?" Kratos looked at the horizon, at the fading snows, at the slow return of green. "No," he said. "Nothing ends, it only changes shape." The boy tilted his head. "Then what are we now?" Kratos thought for a moment. "Alive." The word hung in the air, simple and vast. That night they made camp beneath a grove of birch trees. The bark gleamed pale in the firelight, and the wind rustled their branches like soft laughter. The boy lay on his side, half asleep, while Kratos sat beside the fire, sharpening a blade that had not been drawn in many weeks. Its edge caught the light, then dimmed again. He watched the flames dance and thought of the long road behind them, the mountain, the frost, the gods who had fallen and the ones who had turned away. He had spent lifetimes learning the language of war, the rhythm of destruction. Now, in this quiet place, he struggled to remember how to speak the language of peace. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain. The sky above was deep and full of stars, and for a moment he imagined he could see her among them, not as a goddess, not as memory, but as light. He lowered his head and whispered, "I have done as you asked." The leaves stirred gently, and though no voice answered, the silence that followed felt like understanding. When dawn came, the boy woke first. He sat beside his father and smiled. "The river's louder today." Kratos listened. The water crashed against the rocks, alive and bright. "The world stirs." Atreus stretched. "Do you think it dreams?" Kratos looked at him, the faintest trace of a smile at the edge of his beard. Everything that lives dreams. They packed their things and followed the river east. The path was soft now, the snow turning to mud beneath their boots. Birds flitted through the branches overhead, singing cautiously as if testing their voices after a long silence. The boy walked ahead, humming quietly to himself. By midday, they reached a clearing where a stone bridge arched across the river. Half broken and covered in moss, it looked older than memory. Kratos stopped at its edge, his gaze tracing the carvings along its surface, spirals, stars, and names he did not know. Atreus ran his fingers over one of the runes. What does it say? Kratos squinted at the faded lines. It is not Greek, nor the tongue of these lands. The boy traced the marks again, his lips moving as though the meaning was forming itself. It says, all things return to the beginning. Kratos nodded slowly. The world is a circle. Atreus looked up at him. Then so are we. They crossed the bridge. The river roared beneath, loud and full, carrying the last of the melting snow down into the unknown. On the other side, the path wound upward through low hills covered in new grass. The air was warmer here. It smelled of rain and growth, of beginnings. The boy pointed toward the distance where faint pillars of smoke rose from a valley. There are people down there. Kratos' expression did not change. The world begins to move again. Should we go to them? Not yet. Why not? Kratos looked at him. Because the man I was does not yet know how to meet them. Atreus studied him for a long moment. Then who are you now? Kratos looked out across the valley. A man learning. They made camp that night at the edge of the hill. The boy fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the climb. Kratos remained awake, staring into the fire. The chains at his wrists caught the light, their edges dulled now by years and distance. He lifted one hand, feeling the cool weight against his skin, and for the first time he did not see a curse. He saw a reminder. He closed his eyes. The memories came quietly this time, not as punishment, but as fragments of truth. The faces of those he had lost, the roar of battles long ended, the cries of gods and men alike fading into the wind. And beneath it all, the steady heartbeat of the world, patient, enduring. When he opened his eyes again, dawn had come. The boy stirred beside him, blinking in the new light. "Father," he murmured, "do you think we'll ever see the gods again?" Kratos stood, watching the sun rise. "We already do," he said. "Every time we choose to build instead of break." The boy smiled sleepily. "Then I hope they are watching now." Kratos looked down at him, his voice gentle. "So do I." They walked together once more, following the sun. The air grew warmer with every step. The frost that had bound the land for so long now ran as water beneath their feet. In the distance, the first flowers of spring opened, small and bright against the thawing soil. The boy stopped and looked back at his father. "You were right," he said. "The world remembers." Kratos placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice quiet but sure. "Then we must give it something worth remembering." The wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice, not a god's, not a command, but a song. The song of a world reborn. And in that soft, endless moment, the man who had once been the Ghost of Sparta became what the world had waited for him to be. Not destroyer, not savior, but father. He walked forward into the new day, his shadow long beside his son's, and behind them, the sound of the river sang of what the gods had forgotten, that even the most broken things can flow again. The snow had melted. The rivers had learned to sing again. The frost that once bound the heart of the world had loosened, leaving behind silence, not the silence of ruin, but of rest. The long age of gods had ended, and in its place rose something quieter, more fragile, more enduring, the age of memory. In the beginning, the world had been ruled by thunder and fire, by those who believed eternity could be carved from conquest. Olympus burned. The north trembled, and through it all walked a single man, marked by ash and loss, carrying the weight of everything he had destroyed. He was called many names, ghost, god, killer, curse, yet none of them were true. For beneath the blood and shadow, there had always been something more ancient than wrath. A heart that refused to die. When the mountains fell silent, Kratos did not vanish into myth. He simply kept walking. Through frost and flame, through gods and graves, he followed the sound of his own breath until it became the rhythm of the world. And in that rhythm, he found the truth that no blade or crown could teach. That peace is not the absence of pain, but the choice to live despite it. Atreus, his son, walked beside him, a boy who had never known the world of Olympus, only the quiet beauty of what came after. He carried questions instead of swords, wonder instead of vengeance. In him, the old rage found its rest. In him, the ashes of gods became soil for something new. The two of them wandered beyond the lands of frost and story, into places unmarked by map or prophecy. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of memory, of breath, of the small sounds of life continuing. They built fires not to survive, but to share warmth. They looked to the stars not for guidance, but for peace. And in that stillness the world remembered. It remembered the gods, yes, their storms, their wars, their vanities, but it also remembered what came after. It remembered the sound of snow giving way to grass, of rivers thawing, of a father and son walking home beneath a sky washed clean of thunder. The ghosts of the old age faded, not in defeat, but in understanding. For even gods, in the end, must bow to the gentler truth that creation does not belong to power, but to love. That eternity is not in temples or thrones, but in the way a hand steadies another's shoulder when the road grows steep. And so, the story of the Ghost of Sparta became not a warning, but a lullaby, told by firesides when the wind grew cold, whispered to children who asked where the sun goes when it sleeps. They said he walked beyond the horizon, into a place where gods no longer watched and men no longer prayed, a place where silence was not fear, but freedom. Some say he still walks there, beneath a sky that no longer bleeds, his footsteps echoing softly in the earth that once trembled at his name. Others say he laid down his weapons and became one with the world he had once defied. But all who remember his tale know this: the gods may fall, the heavens may fade, but the heart that seeks peace, even after war, is eternal. And as the first spring wind brushed through the trees, the ashes of the past scattered into the air, and the world at last began to breathe again. Even the mightiest gods must learn what only mortals ever understood, that love endures where power fades, and peace is the quiet heartbeat that follows the storm.